So, hi everyone. I'm here with Paul Jozefak today, who's the CEO of Receive. Receive are in the collection space, and they've got software that really helps with that. So, Paul, thanks very much. Great to see you again.
Thanks, likewise. Glad to be back.
Up, and it'd be good to try and hear a little bit about maybe what you've been seeing with maybe with some of your clients and their customers.
Hmm. Well, yes, quite a bit has changed, and I think things are changing even faster than let's say even a year or two back, right? So,
Hmm.
I think the speed of change has actually even increased, or the velocity of it, so to speak. So we're seeing a lot of things kind of come at us quicker than we had maybe even expected.
Hmm.
So one of the things, if I had to summarize and trying to keep it short, is we see much more sense of urgency on the side of
Hmm.
our customers to actually try and implement solutions,
Hmm.
because I think they're, I hate to say it, waking up and realizing that they're a little bit behind in terms of automation, and even the digitalization. And they're also realizing that if they had put in software or technology, they would be in a position to be quicker to react. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and we're definitely feeling that, because there is a certain level of, even let's say, people who said, "Hey, we'd like to talk to you next year," coming back earlier and saying, "Well, let's talk now, and
Yeah.
how quickly can we get resources from you to put something in place?"
Hmm.
So that's one point, and then the other point with the energy issue, here in Germany, it's a very prevalent thing. In the UK, I hear it seems to be more in the UK, so we definitely hear about it more from your end. But
Hmm.
even here, I mean, the public utilities are all going to have the same problems. Prices are going to be kicking in where, come January, I think a lot of things are going to be repriced. So there's a whole wave of issues coming on that front as well, and we're also seeing the inbound interest from customers there. So there's been a lot changing. I think the way to summarize it, excuse me, is that things are just moving much faster,
Hmm.
and people are trying to react.
And we had quite a lot of discussion around right when you're going to see the impact of energy cost increases and then that feeding through to inflation. But we're going to see that in the collections world into arrears volume. And certainly what I've been hearing is that hasn't really been seen yet, but everyone's sort of like thinking, well, that's probably going to hit in the new year. So is it a little bit of sort of like getting ready for it? Do you think that's sort of going
I
on, or
think it's a getting
just
ready.
yeah?
It's a getting ready for it. I think there was. I mean, again, we maybe even talked about this the last time where you and I discussed it in a different conversation. But there's been a lot of kind of stuff pushing things down the road, right? So
Mm,
a lot of people have maybe been waiting, but they also kind of got impatient,
mm,
or maybe kind of diverted their attention. But what I'm seeing now is that I think a lot of people are saying that that can is not just going to get kicked down the can anymore.
yeah.
All the subsidies and government involvement and whatnot, that's going to run out, and excuse my language, but the shit's gonna hit the fan, right? I mean,
Mm,
that's kind of it's. I don't think things are going to be delayed another year.
mm.
So something, even if I had to be a betting man, I would say come Q1, we're going to start seeing kind of the initial effects, and by some point next year, we're going to be in the thick of it.
Yeah, so people are sort of investing now, trying to just get ahead of it. It sounds like.
Yeah, and I think some people are actually getting ahead of it. That's the point, that those that want to actually be in a good position are actually saying, look, if I wait, then I'm going to be behind the curve. So I want to now actually react and be prepared. And to be honest, if they are prepared, there's nothing to lose, right? I mean, these are things they had to do anyway. So why not do it finally?
Yeah, some of the discussion we've had here certainly is how do you get customers to engage? So it could also be a different set of the population that's now in collections, or a new set of the population that's now in collections that wasn't before, or falling into arrears. So
Mm,
we have people who maybe were in financial difficulties already. They're still there. The situation's still tough for them, but you've got this
hmm
new, almost like on the margin, where you've got new people who seem to be sort of feeling the effects of inflation or energy costs, and they can then fall behind. I mean, and there's a
hmm
part there around like how do you engage those people, because they might have preconceptions around collections, or they might have they've not been through it before, and so there's almost like an engagement question there.
Yeah, I think that remains kind of the million-dollar question, right? How do you
Yeah,
get them to engage more?
yeah,
I think, again, giving them the at least the view that they have options is
mm,
probably one of the ways to get them to react.
mm,
So giving them options when a lot of times you may not have been giving them options.
mm,
I mean, we always use the idea of either installment plans or potentially even offering discounts if people
mm,
prepay. So that's one of the things, that if you actually start offering the customers something to react to versus just the typical quasi messaging that's been used over the past years, that is probably the best way to get them to engage. Give them a view that they have options, that they can take action to do something, and give them the options that actually make sense, right? So if it just ultimately is pay now, pay now, pay now, versus saying, hey, we can put an installment plan in place, or if you prepay or whatever, you might get some discounts. These are all, again, these are just theoretical ideas, but it's just giving optionality tends to be a way to get people to move.
Yeah. And is there a sense around sort of like changing things all the time as well? So it's like how do you change the message? How do you make it more responsive? I mean, one of the things that certainly was coming up recently was talking a bit about attention and attention spans being different, and the fact that
Mm.
how do you grab attention, and what's the content? How can you sort of change the way we might be communicating in a different way than we were before? Um,
Well, it always comes back to kind of how do you get seen, right?
mm,
So you better have the right channel. As we all know, if you're sending out paper mail, that's probably
mm,
the worst way to get any kind of attention, and the time component is horrible. But I think if you're using the right channels and you're approaching it with a, let's say, more of a customer service type of an approach, you might be able to even trigger. Let's put it this way: with an email, you have a subject line, and you have the body. You have two opportunities to actually make an impression. If you use other channels, you might potentially be in someone's pocket, i.e., with certain types of messaging channels, or let's say you have apps where you basically have notifications in it. You have to be top of mind. And your point about attention spans, right? I mean, certain people just don't pay attention to certain things at
mm,
all.
mm,
So if you're not even where they're paying attention, well, it's not even attention. It's a matter of just being seen at all.
mm.
So I think if you adapt your channels, that's probably the best strategy to getting seen. And using the channels where people engage is also where you have the opportunity to hold their attention. And ultimately, what you want them to do is you want it to come back to a page where you can actually get. I mean, ultimately, if you're sending some kind of messaging out to them, you want them to click a link or something to come back to a landing page where you can quasi control the message and show them that there's options, that there's things they can do,
Mm.
instead of driving that kind of fight or flight. Right? I mean, what we always tell our customers is the first thing you have to do is you have to get away from that fight or flight reaction. And once you get over that hurdle, kind of that, I mean, that's the hardest part, right? Because if you trigger fight or flight, then you're kind of going down the wrong path.
So
Yeah.
what are some of the things we can learn from other industries as well? So as we talked about, I think about social media as well in terms of like how they drive engagement. We talk about customer care or marketing even, like how can that be used to then drive engagement sort of today in collections, and what can we learn? I mean, we talked a bit about data, I think it was last time,
Sure.
to drive
Well,
that. I mean, I don't think that goes away, does it?
that's what I was going to say. That if you have the data, you can actually keep the customer engaged even before they're actually in a collections process, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's going to become ever more important that you keep an open channel to your customers, so you
Hmm.
actually continue to communicate with them. Again, this is not a collections problem. This is more quasi, let's say, a retailer or a public utility or a bank or whatnot. That you have that quasi constant engagement of the customer and are communicating with them, because if they're not in touch with you, if you basically ping them once a year with some advertising, or let's say they opt out of regular advertising, you want to actually engage with them in connection with their account, right?
Hmm.
So instead of trying to bombard them with new products, you might want to just potentially remain in touch so that they're aware of what is available to them in the case of cases.
Hmm.
And I think that's something that a lot of people don't spend any time on whatsoever, i.e., engaging with the customers that they have and continuing to communicate with them, keeping those lines of communication open. And
Hmm.
again, not to upsell them. That's the stuff that people click out of, right? They don't want to be marketed to. But if you are giving them compelling information around their account or things that might be happening, like let's say right now, we all know there's problems coming. So why not reach out to your customers and say, hey, there might be an issue next year. Here's some things you might want to do to avoid problems. I mean, give them advice, give them free advice of how they could possibly avoid things. Or if things go sideways, hey, you lose your job, you're not able to, make ends meet, whatnot. Give them options, give them resources. That way you can help them potentially even avoid a problem. Sure, it doesn't help the collections industry because you might actually avoid someone in collections. At the same time, it's a way to continue to communicate with them without trying to advertise to them.
Yeah, but do you think there's a sense around like sort of creating those, when we talk about customer journeys, like how do you create those customer journeys almost like upstream in the life cycle, including signposting for debt advice now? I mean, this is the
Sure.
pre-arrears piece, and it
Are
feels like people doing enough of that? And then what are the things you
No.
would be able to, what are the things you could offer?
Well, think about how many people kind of get into trouble and then have no idea where to turn to,
Yeah.
even though there are resources. And once the person is in quasi a desperate situation,
Yeah.
they're going to behave differently, right? So exactly what you said right now, that you want to start early, and you want to at least let them know where the resources are. And maybe you're the provider of those resources, or at least let's
Mm,
say at least the links to those resources. So
mm,
even letting your customers know that there's, let's call it a help center or whatever you want to call it, a knowledge base, define it as you will, depending on which industry you're in, and use the term signposting. I mean, let them know how to get to where they need to be,
mm,
and yes, give them a heads up before they have the problem, and keep reminding them that there's resources, that there's things available on your website or in your channels of communication,
mm.
which they can fall back on if they come to that point,
Yeah.
or even offering them potentially advice before they get to that point. So saying, look, be in touch with us and we can help you out, or put you in touch with the right people, and maybe even via partnerships or whatnot, offer certain services. I know there's a lot of startups right now actually that are going into that space, that are
Mm.
trying to plug into either the retailers or the collection side of the business. Work with those parties and get people help before they need it, or
Yeah.
at least get them in touch with those people before they need that.
We talk a lot about the collections process and sort of, do you think the, and really, do we need to change that to be almost like an engagement process and actually think much further upstream?
I think it's inevitable that it becomes more of a, I hate calling it customer service, but it has to be a
Mm,
customer service component and not a collections component, because you're always trying to deal with a customer and give them some level of support or service. So
mm,
I'm completely with you on your comment that I think everything's going to move in that direction. And if you think about, let's say, I mean, it almost sounds dystopian, but at some point, we're going to be so digitally active in the sense of all our payments and everything's going to be captured in a digital format, that it'll be even harder for the customer to potentially get out of the way of issues, right? So let's say you could potentially pull money out of their account,
mm,
if you know that there's money there. I've
mm,
even heard of some horror stories where in some countries, banks, for example, because they had the account, they could pull money out of an account even though there was a different account with a loan, for example,
mm,
right? So,
mm.
so and based on regulatory environments and whatnot, what's possible and what's not possible. But let's all presume we're going to be more and more digital in the coming years, even to the point of having digital currencies and whatnot. You're going to have to deal with these customers more as someone you don't want to lose.
Mm.
Because if you can avoid your customer having financial issues, they remain a customer. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll just give you a little bit of a different example. We have a customer we're talking to in Mexico who actually sees their customers constantly in a position of not able to pay. So
Mm,
they almost see their installment plans or their let's say their payment plans as installment plans and rotating, or sorry, revolving loans. I'm forgetting all my English because I'm
mm.
speaking in German all the time. So they almost provide a revolving credit without actually providing a revolving credit. But
Yeah.
that's because they know that if they actually were to ding each of their customers, and they have millions of customers, they would actually have a major issue, because those customers always do come back and pay, but it's just not on time. And it's part of the
Yeah.
culture as well that they might just not pay on time. But they have to take a full customer service approach to this problem versus thinking of the person as someone they just want to get the money from and get rid of.
Yeah.
I think that's all going to change in the future anyway.
You do wonder if that's going to change. So if we do have a significant sort of crisis that happens financially in the new year, in terms of like we have a huge wave of people who can't pay now before. I mean, do we change our collections process from being, much more this sort of like, 30, 60, 90-day kind of pay before you sort of go out to into the, more formal debt collections process, to more like what would be a debt purchase process, which is like looking at over
Sure.
years instead. That sounds a little bit like what you're describing in Mexico.
I think so. I don't think we're going to have the Mexico situation, but I'm just using that as
Mm,
an example of saying that exactly what you said, some of the retailers or some of the public
mm,
utilities or whatnot are just going to have to say, look, we're going to extend collection cycles. We're going to do what ultimately the governments were doing in the last couple of years, and give, let's say payment holidays or something like that to make sure that the customer doesn't disappear. Because you're probably still better off potentially addressing that problem yourself. It all comes back to the data. Can you potentially score each and every one of those situations and determine what's the risk? Right? It becomes, as always, it's a risk game. It's a matter of scoring it and determining, can you actually afford to try and resolve something before giving it away to a servicer, right?
yeah.
I mean, it is a numbers game, and the more data you have, and the better you are at collecting the data, the more you have to work with to potentially then be creative.
And the data we have, and the problem we might have is the data that we have now isn't necessarily representative of what it might be in the future as well, right? So that there's a bit of
Sure.
a bit of a sort of a guesswork, I suppose, there, in terms of like how you then look forward
Yeah.
around that, in terms of a leap of faith to a certain extent.
Well, the more data that you have of your own, so if you start collecting it and you make sure that you manage the data hygiene, then you can actually mine it, right? I think there's so much data available right now that you can't use because it's just total crap. I think the problem is that a lot of customers that we end up talking to, they've could have or they have been in a position to potentially collect a lot of data and take advantage of that data, but they haven't stored it properly and they haven't actually implemented any technology to take advantage of it. That's back to your original question. That's something we're actually talking to more and more customers about who are saying, look, we want to take advantage of the data that we're collecting and we want to become much better at the analytics and mining what's there to figure out what we can do. That's something that's definitely changed in the past year.
I mean, there's also a brand angle which I think is quite interesting as well. So in terms of like, if you're going to take that long-term view, it definitely helps the brand. But then also having a
Absolutely.
strong brand also then helps you in terms of like where you can then come in terms of the hierarchy as well. So, do I pay my mortgage first, and if it's a brand I really like, do I pay, let's say it's Apple or Google, do I pay them first
Sure.
because it's something I really like versus not? And
Yeah.
that sort of typically gets lost in the. I mean, I'm a numbers guy. Gets lost in the numbers, doesn't it? Often because
Sure.
it's a little bit more intangible.
Well, you're going to have also the problem, from the other side. I mean, we see it. Obviously, the public utility is much more intent on collecting
Hmm.
because by law, they can't turn off someone's heat or electricity, right?
Hmm.
So they actually have the problem that someone might remain a user of their server or of their,
Yeah.
so to speak, product, but they can't turn them off. So their collections becomes a much bigger issue. Conversely, if you're a telco, you just turn off someone's phone and they got the problem.
Yeah.
But I think that there's going to be also a blend, right? So you're right that a certain brand. I mean, let's just use Apple, not to say they're the bad guy, but if you think about it, I use Apple for multiple things, right? I have them as an Apple Pay provider. I have them for storage, where I pay them monthly for storage. I have their devices, right? So I have multiple devices in front of me. It's all Apple.
Hmm.
So I might potentially damage my reputation with them by, per se, not paying back a credit card
Yeah.
cost. Not that I have Apple Credit here in Europe, but that might ultimately be the issue that it's also a problem, right? I mean, it's a completely different discussion, but we don't all want to be beholden to one large player.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you nailed it on the head, right? You might want to prioritize an Apple over someone else because God forbid they turn you off completely,
Yeah.
right? Like they think about your Apple account that runs your phone, that runs your laptop, but also ultimately is your account with Apple when it comes to any kind of credit you may have with them or any kind of payment options. If all of a sudden that gets shut off because you've in one part of that product
Hmm.
offering screwed up, you could have a problem. So
Yeah.
yeah, you're totally right. People might just prioritize certain things that we never would have thought of even years ago.
And I was quite surprised when I sort of came back to Europe. We were talking about I suppose treating customers fairly it was at the time, and sort of like that sort of much more sort of softer kind of collections treatment, and
Sure.
it did kind of. The collections rates didn't drop off to the same way as you thought they might would traditionally, and actually good treatment actually seemed to push them up the payment hierarchy, which is a brand kind of discussion as well,
Hmm.
which was a bit of an eye opener I think at the time, and a bit of a leap of faith for folks as well. Um,
You're right about the leap of faith because it's also a complete shift in how you think about all of this, right?
hmm,
And I think there's such an ingrained approach to all of this that that's almost generational to an extent.
yeah.
So I think there's also kind of a, let's call it a generational shift that might be happening now. Because I mean, let's be honest. I mean, the industry in and of itself, let's say collections, we're talking 90s. I mean, kind
Hmm,
of 80s is kicked off, but it's 90s. So think about someone who has a 20 or 30-year career horizon.
hmm.
They might have been in this industry now. They're kind of approaching retirement age. You might even have a generational shift that allows for kind of creative thinking and different ways of thinking about this to be the next 10 or 15 years of this
Yeah.
industry.
And ways of communication are very sort of generational as well. So in terms of like,
Absolutely.
be it letter, be it I suppose email, probably the email generation, be it SMS
Yeah.
and messaging, or even. But I mean, are we missing on new channels? Do you think like like Snapchat is what the young people are using now, or even
Yeah,
TikTok
so
as well? I mean,
TikTok or whatever. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, again, I might already be aged out of it as well. So
yeah,
I kind of also kind of shake my head at times. Like, would I want personal communications via TikTok? I sure as hell wouldn't, right? I just don't see any reason to use a TikTok. If everyone though is using that, and that's the main channel to the younger generation, things do show up, right? And I actually am surprised. I had this experience this morning. There's a person that I communicate with where I only reach him via Twitter DMs.
yeah,
And it just happens to be where, we've met in person multiple times, but we kind of interact with each other on Twitter. And I know that if I DM this person on Twitter, that's the best channel to reach them. So and again, it's my own database of knowing that he is best reachable via this channel. and we just tend to communicate there because the message. What do I care if it's email or a message or whatever, right? It's
Yeah.
just communication at the end of the day, and it's where you find me. But who knows? I mean, maybe in the next couple of years, what I think you're going to see is that there's going to be more private channels. So, like for example, there was a lot of like let's say Telegram, right? So a lot of people were using Telegram for group messaging,
Mm,
for both kind of the black market as well as legit things.
mm,
I'm a heavy user of Signal. I just like
mm,
the privacy aspect of Signal. Maybe at some point there's even a communication channel that's just that much more like secure
mm,
for organizations to use. And if I think about it, like if I was on Signal's side, I would say, look, create some kind of a business component to what you're doing, so that my bank could have a Signal channel with me to communicate with me because I want to keep it fully quasi out of any snooping eyes.
mm.
And keep it from being hacked. So, I mean, thinking along those lines of privacy and creating new channels that are probably more secure, maybe that's even what you then have to think about ultimately. Because again, these kids that are maybe 15 now that are on TikTok, once they're a little bit older and they have a bank account, they don't necessarily want to be using a Chinese provider to do, let's say, quasi communication with their bank.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's the aspect around even things like debt advice videos. I mean, are they on TikTok or not? Or and do we get into different ways of communicating things like terms and conditions in terms of contract, right? So we're getting into this. This comes back to the attention piece where we
Well,
used
back
to
to the
watching these.
signposting as well,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
We're watching these 15-second videos. Do we need to do stuff using 15-second videos rather than long form microprint that comes out on really thin paper?
Maybe you have to do TikTok style videos to do the signposting on your website,
Hmm,
right? So, or when you are interacting with the younger generation and you happen to know that someone's younger and they come to your page, you serve them that 15-minute ad, but it's not an ad; it's the signposting and trying to give them advice and information that could be useful. So instead of actually having messaging or sending out, let's call it text communication, you do it with video. And
hmm,
again, let's be honest, videos becoming ever more prevalent.
hmm.
People don't want to read. So it's not even like the messaging is changing. That's from
Yeah,
email to whatever WhatsApp. It's just becoming all visual and much more video driven.
yeah.
And maybe you have to do a lot more video.
Yeah.
That just might be what you need to do.
One of the concepts that I've been chatting about recently is what's the difference between a Google search bar, for example, and a chat bar, right? And you get into
Hmm.
this almost like two-way chat, or even things like non-player characters you have
Hmm.
in the phone. You can have these conversations with people. I mean, do you think we're going to see the end of web pages? And even the word web pages sounds quite old-fashioned versus much more this sort of stream of consciousness. And so do we need to think about that in terms of communications rather than pointing people to websites, and it becomes a little bit more sort of fluid? I mean, do you think that's going to be a trend?
I think we're in the middle of that because you see also the shift from kind of, let's say, the desktop to the mobile.
Hmm.
When you think about the switch from desktop to mobile, it's from browser to app.
Hmm.
Yes, you also use browsers on the mobile device, but like a TikTok or whatever, you're not using that in the browser; it's in the app.
Hmm.
And if you think about kind of the way people are using the technology, the stream aspect, kind of the continuous stream,
Hmm.
and almost like let's call it customized kind of view. Even if you think about like LinkedIn, which is something that you and I use, right? I'm actually super religious about how my LinkedIn serves me what I see. So I actually
Hmm.
don't follow everyone that I connect with. I
Hmm.
unfollow people fairly regularly, and I have a very quasi, what's the word? I'm like curated stream in LinkedIn, just like I do on
Hmm.
Twitter. It takes work, but I then see what I want to see. And conversely, if you can get into that stream of consciousness, so like, let's say you're trying to communicate that people should be wary of what's coming down the pipes, and they should be thinking about potentially not being in a position to pay their bills.
Hmm.
So you want to be serving into that stream of, you call it stream of consciousness, right? But let's call it
Yeah,
stream of digital, digital
probably a better word.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at some point it's all gonna meld. And I also even just think about how I work, right? So if you think about even like Slack in the typical enterprise as a
Hmm.
communication channel, it used to be emails, now it's Slack. It's just a stream of communication that you have there, and I see it at some point even switching more to video. I mean, we
Hmm.
even use it in our own company where we're sending more video to each other since we're remote. We're even recording things versus doing things real time. It's asynchronous that way. So maybe even that asynchronous communication approach with the very digital types of communication allows you to get into, so to speak, the
Yeah.
forefront of what people are looking at.
And I do wonder if that's a way into almost like when they talk about metaverse and virtual worlds and those. I think in terms of we have video, but you have text to avatar as well, which makes it you can sort of like it blends into the same kind of
It
like
could,
communication panels, right?
It
channels.
could, and if you want to be, I mean, you're talking to a former VC and now
Yeah.
founder. So if we want to, geek out on this, but let's think of it this way. If you think about metaverse and you think about what machine learning and AI is capable of, think about the fact that usually the problem that you're going to have, let's say in the case of collections, so many of those issues are going to be repetitive.
Mm,
So if you basically have the data and you can find out that someone's already had a similar problem and has been able to have that problem resolved,
mm,
let's say mining the text or mining the video that you have of that interaction.
mm,
Ultimately, in a metaverse environment, I could be in the metaverse trying to resolve a problem, looking for someone to advise me. It could be under the underlying quasi input I get back could be AI driven
mm,
because somewhere someone has had that problem before.
mm,
And if you think about it, a lot of the issues that people have when they get into payment problems, it's all I mean, everyone's having the same problems, right? It's
mm,
not like if someone is a complete outlier. There might be one here or there, but there's no one. There's not the outlier of 1 in 10 million, right? There
mm,
might be a million outliers in 100 million because they're all going to have the same problem in some sense, but that's going to be an outlier as a problem. So I think once you have the data and once you have kind of, again, this is geeking out and there's a lot of quasi storage necessary and kind of mining the data, but it's ultimately where if you think of the metaverse, it's not always going to be synchronous. So it might
mm,
actually be an asynchronous interaction, but I might see it as real time.
mm.
So again, I think that that's somewhere where we're definitely going to go, especially advice. If you think about how you use Google right now, or even like no one does anything without saying, I'm just going to Google it and
Yeah.
watch a YouTube video how to do it. And
Yeah.
almost everything nowadays is like, I'm going to cook something, I'm going to repair my car, I'm going to do something in my house. I just Google it, I watch a YouTube video, and I do it.
Yeah.
And I don't even think about it, right? It's
Yeah.
just a natural kind of workflow for me. So maybe at some point it just becomes that natural workflow for anything financial as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're right. So I mean, I do it to fix stuff, or how to mend the dishwasher, or whatever it is. But we don't do it
Yeah.
financially, right? So how do I do that?
Yeah.
Maybe we need to think more about that because
And
it's
think
where the
about it
economy is.
even without actually triggering it by actually typing
Yeah,
in something into Google, right? You're automatically
yeah,
fed something because your computer knows that you just lost your job, you just missed already a payment. So
yeah,
maybe automatically you're kind of in hey, would you like to watch this video on getting out of this problem?
yeah.
And it's just fed to you, right?
So we talked about the economy, and certainly, I mean, what's been interesting is it seems like the pandemic and inflation seems like it's a common story. I mean, the pandemic was a common story everywhere, right? And it's in multiple
Mm.
markets.
When the pandemic hit, everyone thought, oh no, we're gonna have all these quasi issues all of a sudden with collections. The thing is that people stopped spending money on a lot of luxury goods and just paid down their debt,
Yeah,
which was a
yeah,
reaction that no one could have predicted.
yeah,
And let's be realistic right now. When I mean, everyone is aware of the fact that there's a problem coming. Certain people might not be as aware of it because they might not have as much access to data, for example. So someone somewhere in Africa who might not be as digital, or in Southeast Asia or in South America, might not see as much the problem as you or I because we're getting
mm,
bombarded by it. So our spending habits might actually be put on hold sooner than, let's say, other geographies.
mm,
But we might have the same effect, right? We might actually not have as much collections issues because people won't be spending money.
mm,
I think the retailers are going to have a problem, right? Because I mean, I'm not going out and buying new sweaters and jackets and whatnot right now because I just, first of all, I'm working less from the office, so I don't need to buy as much. Pandemic
mm,
effect, and I'm also looking kind of at the next 12 to 18 months and saying where are we going to be economically.
yeah.
So I am pushing out quasi luxury spending, for example, because why bother?
Yeah, it's quite hard, isn't it, at the moment? Because like the speed of change is so fast, and it's quite hard to predict what the collateral sort of changes in behaviour are. So we saw that in the pandemic. I
Yeah,
mean, I think everyone I speak to in Europe, we're all sitting here in houses that are probably like 2 degrees colder than they were this time last year. And
exactly.
then what's the knock-on impacts of that, right? And I suppose the only way you can do it is like how do you react fast when you actually see an issue, and it's that speed of reaction becomes important as much as predicting what's going to happen to a
I
certain
think the
extent.
underlying solution is to be fully digital because if
Mm,
you're now still in a situation where you have quasi outdated systems, your reaction time is that much slower.
mm,
So if I had a message to kind of the market is to say become fully digital because then you can react faster.
yeah,
And that's the name of the game. And I'm with you that I mean how predictable is anything over the last 3 years?
yeah,
Kinda. But
yeah.
even the markets, if you look at the public markets for stocks, for example, I mean, no one knew. The dips and quasi troughs and whatnot, it's all completely almost irrational behavior. The speed of information is so fast globally as well. So again, we're practically talking real time,
Mm,
sitting in two different countries. Everything gets shared immediately. So the effect again is global with anything
mm,
happening. And if you can't react fast enough, I mean, that's probably going to be the name of the game is
mm.
being able to keep up with the speed of change. Yeah,
Fantastic. So I got one last question, which is
sure.
obviously we talked a bit about interest rates and there's interest issues in terms of like cost of capital and those kind of things. Which is, what do you think the impact's going to be on development within the tech sector, and I suppose particularly like the collections technology sector? I mean, are we the start of a slowdown in terms of the innovation, or do you think the fact that it's changing so much means there's going to be even more innovation?
I think the innovation is definitely not going away. I just think it might be implemented
Just different sort.
earlier or later. Even the
Okay.
investors as well, right? So maybe even on the other end, where the investors were buying debt, for example, maybe they start using that technology completely differently. But trust me, innovation is not going anywhere.
Yeah.
I don't see that.
So the change will drive innovation in itself. Well, Paul, thank you very much. As always, it's great to chat to you. So
Thank
always
you.
we always chat about interesting ideas. So really, really appreciate it.
It's always my pleasure, and it's always a good conversation. So thanks again for having me.